Alright guys, Miss Sailor here, so we are going to get into the settling of the West, 1865 to 1890. So, after the Civil War, the devastated South and untamed West were the most distinctive sections of the nation. Both eluded mapping or measuring, for they resided within the powerful myths, these physical regions. Both also provided enticing frontiers for economic enterprise. The West, the far West, between the Mississippi River and California specifically, was what was enticing, all right? The construction of a transcontinental railroad, the military conquest of the Indians, and the policy of distributing 270 million acres of government-owned land at little to no cost to settlers, including women, African Americans, and immigrants. Free land and the possibility of finding gold or silver started a business lure, with millions of pioneers and entrepreneurs capitalizing, moving westward. So, understand that the land west of the Mississippi was largely unexplored. Most Americans, if they thought of it at all, viewed this territory as an arid wasteland suitable only for Indians whom the federal government had displaced from the eastern lands in previous generations. So the reflection of early explorers who conducted scientific treks through the West tended to confirm this belief. Of course, they're wrong. So beginning in the 1840s, a combination of economic opportunity and ideological encouragement changed the way Americans thought of the West. The federal government offered a number of incentives, making it a viable thing for Americans to take on the challenge of seizing these rough lands from others and subsequently taming them. Still, most Americans who went west needed some financial security at the onset of their journey. Even with the government aid, the truly poor could not make the trip. So the cost of moving an entire family westward, combined with the risk as well as the questionable chances of success, made the move very hard for most. While the economic panic of 1837 led to many questions, the promise of an urban America, and thus turned their focus to the promise of commercial farming in the West. So, go west, young man, remains that unfulfilled dream to them. So, the 1890 national census data indicated that the frontier was over. Americans had spread across the entire continent by then. So it was this concept of manifest destiny. It found its roots in the long-standing traditions of territorial expansion upon which the nation itself was founded. This phrase, which implied divine encouragement for territorial expansion, was coined by the magazine editor John O'Sullivan in 1845 when he wrote in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review that it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence, that's God, for the free development of our multiplying millions. Although the context of O'Sullivan's original article was to encourage expansion into the newly acquired Texas, the spirit it invoked would subsequently be used to encourage westward settlement through the rest of the 19th century. Land developers, railroad developers, and other investors capitalize in on the notion to encourage westward settlement for their financial benefit. So soon thereafter, the federal government encouraged this by an inclination as a means to further develop the West. The idea was simple. Americans were destined, and indeed divinely ordained by God, to expand democratic institutions throughout the continent. So, to spread democracy. And as they spread their culture, thoughts, and customs, they would, in the process, improve, and I say that with air quotes, the lives of the native inhabitants who might otherwise resist Protestant institutions. So, Throughout the 1800s, politicians and writers had stated the belief that the United States was destined to rule the continent. O'Sullivan's words, which resonated in the popular press, matched the economic and political goal of the federal government's increasingly commitment to expansion. So, they traveled along several identifiable trails. First, the Oregon Trail, then later the Santa Fe and California trails, among others. Now, the Oregon Trail is the most famous of these western routes, 2,000 miles long and barely passable on foot in the early 19th century. By the 1840s, wagon trails were a common sight. Between 1845 and 1870 is considered to be the height of the migration along the trail. Over 400,000 settlers followed this path from Missouri. Right. So manifest destiny justified in Americans' minds their rights and duty to govern any group they encountered during their expansion. While this commonly held view of that day was a relatively empty frontier waiting for the arrival of settlers, understand the reality is quite different. Hispanic communities in the Southwest, diverse Indian tribes throughout the western states, as well as other settlers from Asia and Western Europe already lived in many parts of this country. So American expansion would necessitate a far more complex and involved exchange than simply filling up empty space. Now, the mining industry. The allure of gold has long sent people on wild chases. In the American West, the possibility of quick riches was no different. The search for gold represented an opportunity far different from the slow plod that homestead farmers faced. So you have the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California that sets a pattern for such strikes that would repeat again and again for the next decade in what collectively became known as the California Gold Rush. And in that development, you would develop boom towns. They would only last for a couple years. Understand that once a mine would be played out, the people would move on. For example, in 1870, the Virginia city, Nevada, was then called the richest city in America, had a population of some 20,000. But today it has fewer than 1,000 residents, and it's because it was a boom town. Now, the Comstock lode was found near Gold Hill, Nevada in 1859. Henry Comstock was a Canadian-born fur trader. He gave the discovery his name. It was a seam of gold and silver dwells. They were 50 feet wide and 1,000 feet deep. And it was the most profitable mine in history to that point. The rapid growth of mining spurred the creation of territorial governments and the cries for statehood. But after Colorado's admission in 1876, there was a long pause in admitting new states because of party divisions in Congress. Democrats refused to create states out of territories that were dominated by Republicans. And after sweeping victory, the Republicans in the 1888 legislative races, Congress did begin to admit new states, specifically North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington State in 1889, Idaho and Wyoming in 1890. Utah enters the Union in 1896 after the Mormon Church agreed to abandon the practice of polygamy. Oklahoma enters in 1907, and in 1912, Arizona and New Mexico became the 47th and 48th state. The final states, Alaska and Hawaii, were added 50 years later. So the surge of Western migration displayed some of the romantic qualities so often depicted in novels, films, and television shows. Now, to assist the settlers in their move westward and the transformation to transform this migration from a trickle into a steady flow, Congress passes two significant pieces of legislation in 1862. The Homestead Act is the first one. All right, born largely out of President Abraham Lincoln's growing concern that the potential Union defeat might happen in the early stages of the Civil War, He was worried about the expansion of slavery westward, so Lincoln hoped that such laws, like the Homestead Act, would encourage the expansion of a free soil mentality across the West. So the Homestead Act allowed any head of household, an individual over the age of 21, including unmarried women, to receive a parcel of 160 acres for only a nominal filing fee. All that recipients were really required to do in exchange was to improve the land within a 5-year period, and you also had to make sure you did not support the Confederacy. Now, when I talk about improving the land, it's very minimal. Owners could clear a few acres and build a small house or barn or maintain livestock. That was considered improving the land. So as settlers and homesteaders moved westward to improve the land given to them through the Homestead Act, they faced difficult and often insurmountable challenges. Okay? The land is very difficult to farm. There are few building materials and even harsher winters. There's a lot of insects, and inexperience led to frequent setbacks. The prohibited price charged by the first railroad lines made it very expensive to ship crops to market or to have goods sent out to the farm. Although many farms failed, some did survive and grow into large bonanza farms. Still, small family farms and settlers who worked them were hard-pressed to do more than to scrape out a living in this unforgiving environment that comprised of arid land, violent weather shifts, and other challenges. It's not actually until 1902 and the passage of the Newlands Reclamation Act that a system finally existed to set aside funds from the sale of public lands to build dams for subsequent irrigation efforts because it was such dry farming. See, prior to that, farmers across the Great Plains relied primarily on dry farming techniques to grow corn and wheat, a practice that many had continued into the later years. A few also began to explore windmill technology to draw water up from the ground. In their houses, the first houses built by Western settlers were typically made of mud and sod with thatched roofs, as there was little timber here in the West for building. Rain, when it arrived, presented a constant problem for these sod houses, with mud falling into food and vermin, most notably lice, scampering across bedding. So it's a lot of weather problems, a lot of house problems, and very, very dry farmings. We will pick up settling the West in a part 2 lecture.